Here I am going for my walk on this cold day, checking out what's walkable. Probably see that my lips are cracking. It's pretty cold out here. My hand's pretty cold, but I can't complain. I do enjoy the cold weather. So I'm gonna think about a few things as I walk. Car coming by. And coming down to a busier road. There's no sidewalks right here, but it's a dead end and it tends to be not too trafficy. Here we're coming to the busier road, and we do have a nice pedestrian button here. I will press. Stop. Okay. That sometimes happens. As I said, this road is busy, but I can't see this sign here, but we do have a dedicated bike lane and a lot of sidewalks and ability to cross. So one of the things I was thinking about is, how does walkability contribute to a sense of community? Nice on the background. And as I'm walking, one of the things that becomes pretty obvious is that you can congregate. You can meet with your neighbors, run into people, stop and talk, have a block party, have kids play outside and safely go to the sidewalk when they need to. Kids can walk to school. It certainly encourages connection because of the ease of getting to each other, which seems quite obvious, but in many cases is not thought about in terms of planning, physical planning of places for people to live. Another thing with walkability and its connection to community is how the physical neighborhood and buildings and place itself contribute to a sense of identity. And in this neighborhood, you can see here, and I'll walk into it in a minute, we're located right on the edge of a town forest. It's really lovely, and there are trails through it. So that would be another thing I was thinking about, was the access to nature. But also in this neighborhood, I think people gain a sense of identity by living right next to this wonderful nature preserve. I imagine that's true in other places with unique features. Certainly in access to nature also gives the ability for people to gain a sense of calm. Walks in nature have been shown to reduce stress and calm the nervous system. So obviously those things contribute to the health of a neighborhood and its people. So this would touch on issues of health equity in terms of access to nature of a community, and the walkability to something that would allow someone to immerse in a natural landscape. I have to say, I also find walking an amazing generator for thought itself. So this is something I would think about in terms of walkability, is just access to that thinking space. So we have some fellow walkers at walking. This is the town forest I mentioned before, and as you can see, some people did come here and park, but most people walk here and then use the trails. And they're really quite lovely. You very quickly get into a place that's separated from the noise of the traffic, and the sense of the busyness of the built world. Sometimes there are swans that are in some of these ponds, but I don't see them right now. It's pretty muddy in here today. It keeps sliding on the mud. We have a lot of dogs and dog walkers, dog families, people with dogs in the neighborhood. And that obviously, well, one, you couldn't have a dog if you didn't have walkability, and the dogs offer a natural way for people to connect. A lot of the neighbors walk their dogs together and connect through the dogs. One of the problems I have is I tend to remember the name of the dogs and not the people. But, like I said, it's cold today, so maybe not as many people out, but there's always people walking around our neighborhood. Oh, there's the dog now. There's a really amazing event which takes place in this neighborhood on Halloween when all the families with young children get together and sort of move together as a swarm through the neighborhood doing their trick-or-treating. And it's a really fun and energetic party, which is so awesome to be a part of. And again, wouldn't be able to happen if this neighborhood and this community wasn't designed to be walkable. I thought I lived in a walkable neighborhood, but as it turns out, I was wrong. In the mornings, when I have to take my 3 children to school and daycare and preschool, there's no way we could walk. I have to drop my first off at a middle school, which starts very early, and then I end up being in the car for about an hour and a half because of the time difference in terms of when I can drop off my preschooler at his school. So it's a very long commute, and I basically get nowhere, and I come back to work from home. But if their schools and preschools were walkable, we would have a way better quality of life in the mornings for sure. Walkability is part of establishing the built environment to cater to the community. No, really, I just said that. It seems like that is the way that we would always create the built environment, but as you will see throughout this video, it has not been the case. What I'm going to explore in this video is not why walkability is a good thing, I think we could all agree on that, but how walkability contributes to community, to its sense of identity, to its connectivity, and to its overall health. Walkability is becoming a more fundamental part of urban and community design, thanks in no small part to Jeff Speck's book, The Walkable City, which had its 10th anniversary last year, and he came out with a new version. And in that book, he argues that a culture of walkability should be central to all cities and communities. And he gives several ways to facilitate doing so. It's really so obvious, but sometimes the best arguments are the ones that end up being the most obvious. I love this quote from the book where he's talking to the former mayor of Bogota, Colombia, and Enrique Peñalosa, who was the mayor, says, "God made us walking animals, pedestrians. As a fish needs to swim, a bird to fly, a deer to run, we need to walk, not in order to survive, but to be happy." And Jeff adds in the book, that thought is beautiful, perfectly obvious, and probably impossible to prove. Why walkability? Walkability is not just about urban design or about walking from place to place in a city or a community. It's about efficiency, and it's about equity, and it is about building upon and creating connection. It's a vision where you can walk where you are safe, with access to what you need and want, where humans are prioritized over cars in the environment. The first thing I want to explore is personal mobility as a public good and how it contributes to the social capital of a community. The ability to walk around a city used to be the norm, certainly before the rise of car culture in the 1950s. And if you go back to the 19th century, the share of the urban population doubled during that century. And people got around by walking. You may have heard of the sociologist George Simmel, who around that time wrote a pretty famous essay called The Metropolis and Mental Life. And in that essay, Simmel argues that urban life alters our psychology to the point where we come to reflect the city's frenetic pace and its assault upon the senses, its contradictions, its exploitation, and its overcrowding. And because of this, we ultimately develop psychological defenses, which are basically indifference. And that is our defense against all of the sensory overload that occurs in a city. Now, against this backdrop, a certain kind of recognizable social type emerged, and I'm sure you've heard of the Flaneur. The Flaneur was the artist-poet, the roamer of the city, the interpreter of the city, sort of detective of the city. He could allow himself to be immersed in the capitalist environment and the masses of people, and yet he kept a certain distance. Not a distance of indifference, though. He was able to analyze what was going on with sort of a higher intellect. The existence of the Flaneur points to the importance of walkability as part of social life at this time. Although the Flaneur moved through the city in a rather detached kind of way. The Flaneur exemplifies an individual experience of walkability in the city, but true walkability enriches community and connects people. Personal mobility is a public good, extending beyond individual health benefits to become a shared resource for entire communities. When an environment is transformed to be more walkable, there is evidence that walkability can then transform people's perceptions of their community, and they begin to view it as more inclusive. And really nothing has changed except for some design features, like perhaps adding some more street lighting or creating better sidewalks that are more accessible for all, or creating sidewalks at all. The more that people walk, the more people will walk, and the more people will run into each other and have casual conversations and meet friends on the street. And all of these things build into a sense of community. Welcoming walkable spaces can also reduce crime and the fear of crime by generating more eyes on the street, which is a very Jane Jacobs idea. This in turn builds more trust in the community. Creating a more walkable city or bikeable city, a more mobile city, can increase community and promote community. In the film, The Street Project, which I encourage you to check out, it's a great film about walkability and urban environments where you can get around and ones where you can't. There's a woman, Dulcie Canton, who was in a terrible bike accident in New York City. But rather than putting away her bike and never riding again, she becomes a cycling activist. And one of the things that she does, one of the many, many things that she does in her activism, is work with community members to teach them how to use their electoral power to get things changed. And that alone is generating more community and connection. Around 2007, New York City began to become more bike-friendly because of citywide activism. But what's interesting is it didn't just change things for the cyclist. This whole movement started to generate a more walkable city. Pedestrian spaces were expanded, and many streets decided to close off for certain hours to allow people to walk around and neighborhoods to live in their streets as they should. Walkable communities facilitate the building of social capital by encouraging unplanned interactions and fostering neighborly connections. During the filming of the film The Street Project, which I mentioned earlier, the pandemic occurred. And what happened actually was fortuitous, because there was a neighborhood on 34th Avenue, and this was a pretty crowded neighborhood. And when people were told to not be close to each other, to social distance, there were really no options. There were many people living in apartments together. So what happened is one man sort of led this effort, but the community itself came together and they closed off the street. And this has continued since the pandemic. And the founder of this movement has lived there for at least 20 years, and he said that he's met more people through this effort and since this effort than in all the time since that he's lived in the neighborhood. So clearly, not just creating walkability, but creating spaces where people can be together is going to generate more community. In the video, you can see they are having a circus one day and kids are playing in little pools, and people are using the streets as another space to conduct their living. Walkability is also connected to equity. Historically, the urban renewal of cities has often coincided with the destruction of neighborhoods. One famous example is the redesign of Paris in the 19th century, ordered by Napoleon III. And he had his prefect, George Eugene Haussmann, direct this project. And Haussmann's Paris is the one that we know, with the beautiful Arc de Triomphe and all of the boulevards extending from it, and certainly is beautiful. But in order to create those boulevards, he had to cut through many existing neighborhoods. Now, these were written off as being dirty and polluted and unsafe and unhealthy, some of which probably was true because the housing was right next to the factories, et cetera, et cetera. However, this has often been used as an excuse to cut through neighborhoods. Some will say that the true purpose of the Boulevard project was to stop the possibility of revolution in Paris. Now, if you've ever read or seen Les Mis, you know about the building of barricades in the streets as part of a revolution strategy. Well, Napoleon certainly wanted to put an end to that. The neighborhoods that Haussmann cut through were working class neighborhoods. And if this sounds familiar to you, if it rings a bell and reminds you of one Robert Moses, well, you wouldn't be wrong. For example, one of Robert Moses's famous projects is the Bronx Expressway. And in pushing for this to be built, he argued that these communities that were there, the neighborhoods that were there, were of little value. There was nothing important. It wouldn't really be a big deal to people to move them, which was a complete lie. He cut through vibrant and rich neighborhoods full of culture. He could have built the road another way, but he was insistent on asserting his power, as Robert Moses did. This is known as infrastructural racism, where the infrastructure of a city or community itself creates an environment of racism, an environment that continues and builds into existing racist structures. In the intro to his 10th anniversary of the Walkable City, Jeff Speck talks about going to Houston in 2019 to give a lecture. When he shows up at the theater where he's going to speak, there are all kinds of protesters. And what they were protesting was the expansion of I-45 through their city. The Texas Department of Transportation was trying to convince people that the expansion of this road would actually reduce congestion and improve air quality and make everything better for people. And as Jeff Speck says, that those are promises that no highway in America has ever delivered on. The planned project would destroy up to 1,200 units of housing, around 300 businesses, and eliminate up to 25,000 jobs. At just one elementary school, 40% of the students would lose their homes. 40% of the attending students at that school would lose their homes. And there was a historic church in the line of demolition. The fact is that air quality would worsen with the expansion of the highway. And already along the highway, there were many schools and daycares. So now you're having environmental racism on top of infrastructural racism. In his introduction, Jeff notes that according to the Los Angeles Times, more than 200,000 people have lost their homes to federal highway projects since 1990. These include 750 families in Tampa, 850 in Los Angeles and Orange counties, and thousands more in between. These families have been mostly Black and Latino. This is what the planner Destiny Thomas calls infrastructural racism, as I mentioned earlier. Phoenix, Arizona is one of the worst places to live in terms of walkability. It's really a city that has been built for cars and for people to drive from where they live to anywhere else. In the film The Street Project, there's a scene of a woman who lives in the urban core of Phoenix, and she's trying to cross the street. She's at a crosswalk. And cars are zooming by, nobody's stopping. She's yelling, "This is a crosswalk," and nobody cares. And finally, one truck does slow down and stop, but it's a really, really big road with multiple lanes of traffic. And the other cars continue to zoom by, and then people are honking at the one car that has stopped. She finally gets to the middle of the road and is almost out of the road, and someone pokes their head out of the car and yells, "Get out of the road!" In many of these cities or communities, these giant multi-lane highways or roads cross right through where people need to go. And oftentimes they're fenced off. This one was not, which means that people cannot get to what they need to get. What would, if you took the direct path, be a 2-minute walk to a grocery store or department store, is now a 20-minute walk because you have to go all the way around this highway to an access point where you can cross. So it's completely unfriendly in terms of allowing people to access the things that they need. It's been shown that there are more traffic incidents in low-income communities. The streets are wider, encouraging cars to go faster. There are fewer bike lanes and sometimes no sidewalks. And the thing is, more than 1/3 of bike commuters come from the lowest 25% of income earners. Meaning, obviously, they don't have a choice of other modes of transportation. There's an effort that has started, and it's called Vision Zero. I'll link to it in my show notes. And its goals are to reduce traffic fatalities, eliminate traffic fatalities, and to increase healthy, safe mobility for all people. This is a movement that started in Sweden, but it's been gaining on in some major American cities. Interestingly, it was proposed in Phoenix to use Vision Zero as a basis for redesigning their city, and the city council rejected it, saying that they didn't have the funds for such an effort. Meanwhile, they're putting billions to building new roads. Walkability contributes to community health. There's efficiency. Bike lanes can move up to 6,000 people an hour, whereas car traffic can only move 1,300. So even if you want to just think about efficiency and getting people around your city better, bikes are a way better choice. Many Scandinavian cities are extremely bike friendly, but it wasn't some hippy-dippy or environmentalist desire, at least at the start, when they became more so. In the 1970s, there was the oil crisis, and basically these countries had no money. So people had to start moving around on their bikes or feet. And they had to retrofit their cities to make them way safer when they found that people were getting killed. Walkability also contributes to community health, because if you think about it, if people live in an unwalkable community, they're more homebound, and therefore they're more likely to feel isolated, become lonely. Whereas when they can walk around, as we've talked about and is just so very obvious, they can run into their neighbors, they can talk to people, they can have a sense of agency in that they can do what they need to do, get their groceries and get things they need and come home. Donald Appleyard did a study. He's a professor of urban design. He did a study back in 1982. And what he found was that people living on streets with lower amounts of traffic had 3 times the amount of friends as people living on streets with higher traffic. The shift is really occurring. Around half of Americans would choose to live in a walkable community or over having a house with a big yard, and yet only 1 in 10 Americans do live in those types of communities. Walking contributes to a sense of pride. It uses no external energy sources, and it's good for your health, and it generates creative thinking. Now, I'm sure that you've had an experience where you go on a walk
and suddenly the idea comes to you that you've been trying to figure out the solution to the problem. I've certainly had this experience many, many times. I find that when I try to sit at a computer and write something, my thoughts are all garbled. Immediately when I go for a walk, things become clear. So I've started bringing a recording device just so I can get what I've thought about down. But walking offers important thinking time. A landmark study from Stanford found that walking increases creativity by 60%. They studied creativity when people are sitting versus when they are walking, and the increase was just amazing. And if you're wondering how all this contributes to community, well, creative thought is so important, and it's not an isolated thing, it's a social activity. And if you have more creative people in a community, you're going to have more entrepreneurs, more spirited and dynamic ideas for solving all kinds of problems, including problems facing the community, but also for creating wonderful new ideas. And just like Dulcie Canton in New York, creative thinking can be a catalyst for social change. But it honestly just seems that having access to creative thinking should be a human right, along with all the other things that Walkability brings. There's actually an upcoming class, I think, at Harvard about the walkable city, and I'll link to this in the show notes. And I hope you like this video. Please subscribe, and I'm excited to announce that in my next video, I will be interviewing Amy O'Leary, who's the Executive Director of Strategies for Children, and we're going to talk about how she created the online community called the 930 Call, which she started during the pandemic and has grown to be this amazing community of early education and care leadership in Massachusetts. So look for that video coming soon, and I will see you next time.